So welcome. You should see my screen now. I'm Martin Shoemaker, and these are my Story Jazz sessions, trying to share lessons I've learned about writing and the business side of it and the craft side of it, and have taught in various venues. And now I've got the courses ready to share with you all publicly here on the internet. And today is going to be Jazz Sessions. I think this is actually number 4. I need to edit this slide. Not on your life. Contract clauses I wouldn't sign. And I'll be talking about specific clauses from example contracts so that you can understand my way of thinking. You make up your own minds, but you can understand my way of thinking of why I wouldn't sign these particular clauses.
If you're good at something, never do it for free.
Now I say that, and here I am giving away free classes. My mentor, Mike Resnick, used to teach us in workshops that this is a business you're supposed to get paid, as he's giving free classes and giving free advice and sometimes giving free stories to small markets he wanted to encourage. So yes, it's a business. Yes, you want to get paid, but sometimes you're paying it forward. On the other hand, I'm going to take a minute for what we call paying for the soup. Going to talk about a couple of books or stories I do have available that I'm hoping you will be interested in after you've heard me talk. You just say, hey, I want to go take a look at these. On the left is my latest release. It's a series called Maxwell's Demons. It's police procedurals on Mars. And this is the very first episode. I was planning an episode a month, and then I had a stroke, and I kind of got knocked off for a while. But I'm getting back up now and getting some writing done. This first one, Dust to Dust, is the story of an investigative team going out because they find a dead body in a crater, and there's a dust storm coming that could entirely cover any evidence. So they've got a limited time to find out how this body got there and who killed him. On the right is my book for writers, Making Story Models. It's visual tools for thinking through problems in your story. Whether you're an outliner, you can come up with good visual outlining methods, or whether you're a pantser or a discovery writer, it can help you figure out ways to think through problems when you're stuck. This book was largely based on investigations I did and studies I did as part of preparing for the FireCon conference, which comes up in the fall, where I teach very frequently. Many of the sessions here in my jazz sessions started originally as FireCon classes. I wrote this one very much with the late Dave Wolverton in mind. I wish he had gotten a chance to see it before he passed away. But Dave was one of many mentors who went into shaping that book. And that is, it is the sum of literally a decade of thinking on story structure and story elements that I put in. So if you like what I'm teaching here, take a look at that. And Anne Marie has joined us. Hello, Anne Marie. I'm back to the tie this week. I'm Mr. Respectable again.
You were respectable last week too.
And as Anne Marie knows, and for you two joining us new, I think you're both new here. Your questions are more important than my slides. I could record the slides entirely without you here. Again, it's material I've gone through before, but your questions I can't anticipate. So do not hesitate. If a question comes up, just unmute and just ask. Don't feel like you have to wait, because your questions are more important. So, one of my fundamental principles in all of my classes is tools, not rules. As far as I'm concerned, there's one unbreakable rule in writing, which is you have to write. Anything else anybody tells you is a rule is a tool. And it might be a useful tool, but it's still a tool, because whatever you propose as a rule, I will go out and find a dozen bestsellers who broke that so-called rule. So think about these as tools, whatever I teach in my classes. And even if I say it's a rule, it's still just a tool. As some of you know, I can be somewhat hyperbolic in my discussions. I may call something a rule to emphasize a point. I may call it a rule because I want you to treat it as one while you're learning, but it's never a rule. It's always a tool, even if I say it's a rule. So to get going from there, our introduction, there are some things I want to get right out front here. You may have different reasons for writing and for submitting and publishing than I do. Your goals are not my goals, and vice versa. I am not your lawyer, just as the, what is it, IANAL, the Common Internet acronym. I am not a lawyer. I'm not anybody's lawyer. Legally, I cannot advise you on things. And you should take whatever I say skeptically. I'm providing a perspective. I'm not providing legal advice. But I can definitely tell you what I would do or would not do or have done in the past. So I can explain my reasons for my decision making, but I cannot give you legal advice. And this is serious, at least within U.S. jurisdiction. I assume it's true for most jurisdictions. If I told you to sign that contract and you went in and you got completely robbed of all your future writing earnings, you might have some recourse to come back at me, but I'm not a lawyer. I didn't give you legal advice. If a lawyer told you sign that contract and you lost everything, you have official legal recourse in the courts to come back at them so that they must make it right. That's the difference between a lawyer and somebody spouting off on the internet. The somebody spouting off really doesn't have a whole lot of legal obligations, which is why, again, I say, I am not giving you advice. I am telling you what I have done or would do in particular situations. Homework for this class. If I was really giving homework, you should have had this advice ahead of time. So this is after the fact homework. Pick up NOLO's copyright handbook. There's a new version every few years. You can find it in libraries. You can often find old versions that aren't that far out of date that can teach you the basics for really cheap in used bookstores and such. This really is copyright from the point of view of writers. You can trust NOLO. You can't trust me. You can't trust strangers on the internet. But NOLO gives you a really good understanding of the basics. So if anything I say sounds really weird, look it up in NOLO. If it sounds great, like that means I'm in good shape, look it up in NOLO.
I didn't know this book existed, but I had wondered about like writing music lyrics and stuff because I didn't want to overstep in any way.
Yep. Music lyrics are a tricky one. The general smart advice is stay away from them. Just stay away.
Okay.
Because part of what constitutes copyright infringement is what percentage of the work, what proportion you are replicating. So if you replicate a paragraph out of my book, that's a paragraph which might be 20% of a page or less out of 200 pages. It's a minuscule amount. If you reproduce one stanza out of a song, that might be 20% of the whole song. And so the likelihood that you will be judged to be violating is much higher. You can, if it's an older song, you can use it. If it's old enough to be well out of copyright, and I do not advise on how to look that up. I know there are ways, but I've never had to do it. There are also cases where you can contact the songwriter. Make sure it's the writer, not the performer. Contact the songwriter for permission to reproduce the lyrics. And I have had them actually agree on one case of that.
Okay.
Some of the record companies actually own the copyrights to the lyrics and songs.
Yep,
Like
absolutely.
I've got permission from a few bands to use their work on my YouTube channel, but they have to go through the record company for me to play that version of it.
Yep. In some of my videos, I play some music from Shira Tombolian, who is a friend, a doctor, married to a doctor, that she practices in California and Alaska, back and forth and back and forth, and so does he. But on top of all of this, she is a symphonic composer from quartets up to larger groups. And we had to go through her company, her publisher, to get permission for me to include some intro and extra music. Even though she technically is her company, YouTube and such would not accept her permission, her printed permission, and my $50 that I sent her until it came in on her company's letterhead. Because YouTube
Oh,
has
okay.
automated algorithms that sniff for music. And they're not very bright algorithms.
Right, and they give your payments to them.
Yep. SP Samtao is a science fiction writer going back into the 70s. He is also an amazing composer and conductor out of Thailand, and in fact is the composer and conductor for, I believe it's called the Thailand National Symphony. And he has produced amazing, amazing work on various classical symphonies, and I forget which one it was, but it was one that, I mean, it was, the symphony itself was well out of copyright. His orchestra recorded it, so he had proof of that, but the algorithm thought that he was duplicating a London Symphony recording of the same work. And so he got copyright hits and had to spend about 3 weeks producing proof that this was his symphony that was producing this, that he had a video of them performing it. The algorithms are
Okay.
stupid.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
He's got a great werewolf book called Moondance.
Yep. Okay, we need to talk about old books sometime, Rich. It sounds like you've read some of the older classics that I thought most people had forgotten.
Yeah, right. It started in the 80s.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk sometime. All right, so I am not a lawyer, repeating again, but I have some what I consider educated views on copyright that I will share with you and you will want to verify. Anything you produce in a tangible form is immediately under copyright when you produce it. Even these slides, every blog post you make, every Facebook or social media post you make is under copyright. Now, the value of it, the value of any one Facebook post is essentially zero, but it is technically under copyright, so no one else can reproduce it, use it, build upon it, or anything without your permission, which of course it's impossible to stop in so many cases, and you wouldn't even want to try with a Facebook post. But this is why Facebook has these terms that every few months somebody will get up in arms because they actually read their Facebook terms of use and discover that they have granted Facebook rights to that post and to the pictures they post and everything. It's like, you don't understand. If you do not grant them those rights, they can't show it to anybody. The terms of use are granting the rights so that Facebook can show your stuff to other people like your friends and family. If they do not have those rights, it's like you sent them an email. And surprise, surprise, you do not actually have the rights to share an email somebody sends you, technically under copyright. Now, if you do that or I do that, the losses are fractions of a penny at best. If you do that or I do that, the amount of damages you could actually collect from me in my current state of financial solvency, it wouldn't be enough to pay a lawyer. But if you're the multi-billion-dollar Facebook company, you could come after them for some damages. And so they create their terms very carefully so that you must give them permission to share the stuff you send them. And you can even decide what audience you send it to. You can even restrict, don't show it to particular people. My friend Dawn Ray, whom I love dearly and is just absolutely enamored with goats and sheep and kittens and other stuff, for the life of me, I can't explain it. She positively loathes rabbits. And so when I share a rabbit video, I go up and take the extra couple of steps to click to say, show this to everyone except Dawn Ray, because I don't want to offend my friend. They're cute and fuzzy and adorable, but she grew up on a farm, and apparently not all rabbits are cute and fuzzy and adorable. So Facebook's terms are set up the way they are, not so that they quote unquote own everything you do, but so that they have your permission to share with the people you want to share it with. Now, when we're getting to the point of submitting stuff to markets, we'll come back to that of it is my copyright and I am telling them what they can do with it. So no one can reproduce it. No one can make money from it. Under the Berne Convention, which is the copyright agreement that most of the world conforms to, China does not, and I don't think Russia does yet, and some other countries, but for the most part, under the Berne Convention, copyright for a single work produced by you extends until 70 years past your death. The theory being that your family, your heirs, ought to have a fair chance to profit from it first, assuming there is any profit. Or if it's a collaborative work owned by a corporation, it's just 90 years after it was created. So that is how I view my copyrights. That is how I recommend you view yours. And I recommend you do your research to make sure that I'm not pulling your leg. But I can license these rights. And that's what you are actually doing when you go to a market and they publish your work. I can license part of my rights. So it could be print, ebook, audiobook. It can be formats not yet determined. So you could license the rights to formats not yet determined. And when somebody comes up with telegraphic books, that publisher already has those rights. I don't recommend that you do that because there could be money in telegraphic books. So telepathic books, not telegraphic books. There could be money in telepathic books. So do you really want to give those away? But in fact, this was a big gray area when ebooks started coming out because some writers had actually licensed out future formats not yet known. And that's it. They've licensed it. Others had not. And some publishers took the stand that they had implicitly. And so there was a lot of back and forth on that of publishers publishing audiobooks or ebooks they did not actually have rights to. And so that had to be fought back and forth. But I could license just some of these rights. Classic case I mentioned in last week's talk. Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, originally put his ebook up on Kindle because his book was written as blog posts, and a couple of readers said, that's too hard to read. Can't you just put it on Kindle? Well, I have to charge you then. They won't let me charge less than 99 cents. I'll pay 99 cents for just the rights to read it. And next thing you know, it's blowing away. It's the best-selling science fiction by far on Kindle. And along comes a publisher for print who says, we want to do a print version of your book and your ebook. And he said, no. I'm already making, I forget what it was, something like $10,000 in the first 3 months on the ebook. Why do I need you for this? And they said, because that's the terms we want. And he said, I don't want them. And they came back and said, okay, we'll just do the print books. So you can slice up your rights into smaller pieces. There are also rights, and these come up in some of the contract terms we'll be looking at, derivative works. So sequels, comic books, adaptations, TV, movies, and so on. You own the rights to all of that as well. So you have the right to license or not. And we're going to be looking at some contracts where they kind of ignored the or not. You can also restrict by region. Once upon a time, it was very common to restrict to North Americans, so you could sell to other markets. Some people, not me, some people make more in their foreign markets than they make in their North American. They're very popular in various other countries. These days, you're unlikely to see somebody license North American. They're likely to want instead World English. I don't consider that to be a rights grab. They're really trying to accept the reality that the internet is everywhere and everybody who speaks English is kind of one community. And so if they are licensing World English, I'm not complaining because that means they have some reason to sell there. And while I have made most of my money in the North American market, I've made a fair chunk in UK and Australia because my publisher promotes there every couple of months. You can also restrict by time. And some of these contract terms are going to say, no, you can't. Give them whatever finger you want to give them. You can restrict by time frame. And very often with short fiction, it's as simple as 6 months or a year. The longest I've seen with short fiction is 18 months. I don't even consider 18 months unreasonable. More than that, I start to get worried. But 1 year is pretty common, and I'm fine with that. What that's saying is the rights you've licensed, so ebook and print for World English is exclusive for 1 year. That means you can't sell them to anyone else. Excuse me, to use the term properly. License them to anyone else during that time. Because the whole reason they paid you this big chunk of money up front, 8 cents a word is the typical, and that adds up. The reason they did that is because they wanted everyone who wants your story to come to them for that period of time. Now, as a side note, every science fiction market I have dealt with recently has an exception clause to their exclusivity of a year or whatever. But you can put it in a year's best collection if you are invited into that collection. We will grant that exception. And I've been in a couple of years' best collections, so that has been a case where if they had not, they didn't have to. I didn't ask for it. I wasn't smart enough to ask. It's part of their standard contract. If they had not had that as their standard contract, I wouldn't really kind of be where I am today, because part of my reputation was those year's best appearances where all of a sudden people all over the world were seeing me in a different market from where the stories appeared. It's very common to have a longer term for novels. They tell me 7 years is now very common. I would prefer 5. But remember, contracts are always negotiable. You never have to sign, and you can always propose changes, and they never have to sign your changes. It's a negotiation. I don't know that I'd be thrilled about 7 years, but I'd be okay with 5, certainly. Yeah, Sophia?
When you write a sci-fi series or a novel, does it have to automatically become a series for them to want to sign you on? Because I guess I assume most sci-fis are series.
That is a yes and a no answer. From different publishers, you'll get different answers. What I think is the most accurate answer is if you're new, they want series potential from you. A new writer is a risk for them. Tony Weisskopf once talked about these numbers at Superstars Conference. I know if Anne-Marie, you were there for this one. If you haven't been to Superstars, it's a wonderful business conference with some craft on the side. And Tony was the guest of honor one year. And she said that when you pick up their monthly catalog and there's a person with their book, essentially the whole front cover, that's their headliner, that is somebody they know will sell enough to bring in half of their income for that period. And then you've got the pages behind that, which are a bunch of not headliners, but mid-listers, which are people who are proven writers of various ability, and they are going to be bringing in the other half of their income for that period. And towards the end, they have the new writers like, wait a minute, if these bring in half and these bring in half, what do these bring in? And the answer is no, we lose money on them. We're not publishing them to make money. We'd be glad if we do. We're publishing because where do you think mid-listers and headliners come from? Right. Everybody has to start someplace. And so they're taking a chance on a new writer that you will actually make them money. And if you do, boy, they want that series of more books. But they're not going to commit to that series if you might never pan out. And so what they kind of like is a first book with a finish and series potential. And that series potential, if they like what they see, that's a little bit of extra reasons why they would buy. But they are likely to buy the series right out the gate. But talking about contracts, what they may very well have in the contract is right of first refusal on your next book. And that is not saying they must buy your book. And that is not saying you must sell it to them. They're saying you must show it to them before you show it to anyone so they can decide. And if they offer you right of first refusal, you want to make sure it says something to the effect of, I'm not a lawyer, this is just kind of the words. And refusal, a decision is to be made within a reasonable time frame of X months or something like that. So you are giving them the chance to turn it into a series
Okay.
before anybody else takes it.
Okay, yeah, that helps because I have a series and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be a series or not, but that kind of helps me decide a
Yep.
little more.
Tony's answer was make that first book have everything good you can possibly put in it to sell it. Don't hold things back for the series. If you've got a really great battle that's going to just amaze people, then put it in that book. Now, that's Bane's opinion. Other publishers might have different opinions.
Look at a different angle.
Okay.
So the most I've made on a short story is $1.50 a word.
Yowza.
Yeah, it was to a non-fiction magazine that buys fiction sometimes.
Okay.
So they publish, you know who CACM is?
Computing machines is the last two letters, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about computer sciences. So they bought a flash fiction, and that's what they buy, and up to 1,200 words. But their contract is a for hire contract,
Yeah.
which means I lost the rights to my story and my characters.
Yep.
So that's just something you didn't mention, and I don't think many people do mention.
And that's a decision. This is where I said earlier, your goals are not my goals and vice versa. That's a decision you make as an individual on a case-by-case basis. I have actually done that with 3 stories where, again, the price was so good, I was willing to give up those 3 stories forever.
Yeah, that was it for me.
That it's like, I can't pass this up. But if you had brought that same thing to me, I would have said, you need to think on this, and here's the consequences, but I would sign this. In this particular case, the 3 worlds, okay, one was a story already sold to Analog once, so it was a reprint story, and they just wanted it cut down to 750 words. So I had a story that essentially I could theoretically resell and resell and resell, but I don't think I'd ever make what I made in that one sale. The other 2, one was a world I made up entirely because the opportunity was there, and one was a story that had been kicking around in my head for almost literally a decade of I had a great ending to the story, and writing to get to that ending was going to be long and tedious, and I just didn't have the ideas. And suddenly when they asked for a story, I'm like, I think this ending fits within their range. And so I just wrote the ending and implied the rest. Now, you did use the term work for hire, which many of them are going to try to use. Be wary of that because it actually has very specific meaning that they seldom mean. And I don't know if yours was necessarily work for hire. Real work for hire is they say, here is the idea. You write this.
Right, it was my idea. It was a bounty hunter that was in love with his spaceship trying to pay it off.
Yeah. So technically it wasn't true work for hire, but the terms were so good you accepted it. In the comic book world, a lot of stuff, if you're writing for Marvel or DC, they own those characters. They own the basic ideas. So those are work for hire. But if you come to them with a new character, and they get all sorts of complicated negotiations with this, if you come to them with a new character, in the modern world, it's generally accepted that that new character is your property. In comic books,
Actually,
50 years
comic
ago, that
books-
wasn't the case.
Most comic books, when you create something for the company, they pretty much own it.
Yeah.
you get creator credits,
Yeah.
and they do pay out, like Marvel will pay out a royalty, and then DC has something like a royalty, but it's a different term. So
Yeah.
they give you money, like if that character appears in a movie, you'll have a
Mhm.
percentage of a movie and a nod in the movie credits and stuff like that, but they still own the character.
Yeah.
That's
So,
why they created Image, because they did that.
yeah. So it is common to have longer terms for novels. You can also have, and this is what I prefer if you can negotiate with them, which is the copyright expires when the book stops selling. And this actually used to be the term long ago. It was when it's out of print. Not the copyright, but the contract expires when the book is out of print. But in these days of ebook, is anything ever really out of print? In these days of print on demand, is anything ever really out of print? So if you want a out of print clause, you need to define it in terms that are concrete. And if you get a little clout, you can probably get away with this. If you're newer, and I consider myself in that newer range, you probably can't, but it's like it needs to generate $100 of royalties for me in a year, or we consider it out of print. Or it needs to sell so many copies in a year or something like that. So restriction by sales targets is better if you can negotiate it. What you don't want, as I mentioned earlier, is perpetual or life of copyright. And we talked about exclusive or not. There are first and second. And in first, that's the first time the story has ever appeared in that format, in that market. And then second is it comes in again reprinted. Generally speaking, a significant price advantage to first because they want to introduce readers and draw readers in with the new stuff. Licenses may be assignable or sublicensable or not. And what you're going to find with most contracts is you cannot assign or sublicense and they can. Do you want to put up with that? You can negotiate. But the reason they do it that they can is because they may want to sell the business. They may have buyers come in. They don't want the buyers to have to negotiate for every single person who ever sold a story to them. So they think, well, then I should be able to assign and sublicense. And you say, then why shouldn't I? Well, because you're different. But I will generally sign something that says that even though I don't think it's fair. Can add any restrictions where both parties agree, and you can sometimes have licenses surrendered. That is less common, but sometimes somebody's like, I'm out of this business, I'm surrendering my license, or I'm never going to print this, I'm surrendering my license. Sometimes that's right in the contract. It has to be printed within X months, or your rights come back without you having to pay back any money received. So I talked about your goals and my goals. You need to decide why you're writing. And it doesn't have to be the reasons why I'm writing, but some of the things we're going to be looking at are terms I wouldn't sign for my goals, but you might sign for yours. Like Rich said, he couldn't pass up the $1.50 a word for that opportunity. Even though generally I would say that's a bad thing. Making money was one of his goals, and it really satisfied his goal. Keep in mind that your stories have value, you have value, and you have to decide what that value is to you. You never have to sign a contract. You can always edit before you sign, but they can then not sign it on their end. And if you're going to edit, you might want to engage a lawyer to do the editing. If you trust your agent, you might have your agent do it. Be aware that there is literally no legal requirement for what you have to be a lawyer or to be an agent. There is for a lawyer. And if your agent, again, negotiates a really dumb clause, you have very little recourse to that agent because agent law in this country it's ramshackle. And even the agent law we have is sometimes ignored. So recommendation, if there's any serious money involved and you want to negotiate the contract, pay a lawyer to do the negotiation and the editing. Remember the power of no. Andy Ware said, no, you can't have the audiobooks. and they came right back, or the ebooks, and they came right back and said, huh, I guess we still want the print books because there's money just to be made. All right, so we're going to talk about a contract. So let's briefly get on the table the minimum things that make up a contract. Offer, acceptance, and consideration. Offer, generally from the person who drafted the contract, is this is what I think we want to do together and the terms of it. Acceptance is how both parties, but particularly the recipient, indicates consent to that agreement. And usually it's signing. You hear talking in many times talking, people just don't know what they're talking about. But sometimes it's legitimate. They'll talk about a verbal contract. And yes, there are legitimate enforceable verbal contracts. They're rare and really hard to prove who did and said what because they're verbal. But the acceptance is only binding when both parties accept the contract. Consideration are the terms of the contract, who's giving what to who. I'm giving you these rights for this period of time for this story, and you are giving me this money on this schedule. So those are the three pieces. If you do not have those three pieces explicitly, preferably, or at least implicitly and documentable, you don't have a contract. Questions on those? All right. When you read a contract, you want two things above all else. You want to be careful and you want to be skeptical. And here's the first red flag in discussing a contract. Well, we would never do that. Then you shouldn't mind writing it into the contract that you can't do that. If they say, we would never do this thing that would be horrible and awful for you, then write it down. Because here is the nightmare scenario that happens far more often than you like. Your best friend since kindergarten, who is the publisher, who wants your work, who loves your work, and who is just ready to make you rich and famous, signs your contract and agrees to your terms, and because you're friends, you don't work very hard on the friends, and your best friend gets run over by a truck. And the next person in line is your worst enemy on the planet, taking over the business, and they are going to use every letter in that contract to screw you over. And you in court have essentially only the written words of the contract for recourse. Now, in reality, you go into court and have all sorts of arguments back and forth, trying to persuade what was really meant, and they argue the opposite, back and forth. It costs you a whole lot of time and money when you could be writing. So if you hear the we would never do that, the answer is always, then let's put it in writing. Read it many times before you sign it. After you can. And if there's a good relationship there, go ahead. You can say, hey, can we amend this? And again, you can ask for help. Lawyers, good help. Agent can be help. Friends, they're not going to have to defend you in court. And strangers on the internet, and for the purposes of today, even if you know me, consider me a stranger on the internet, the only legal advice you should accept from strangers on the internet is never accept legal advice from strangers on the internet. When someone tells you how, say, public domain works, or fair use works, or even the things I'm telling you here, check it for yourself. Do not trust some random person on the internet because there are so many myths going on about there. Fair use being one of the worst ones. Fair use is essentially an exception in the copyright law to say, look, I have to be able to discuss your work with other people. I have to be able to review it. I have to be able to tell students about it. I have to be able to make jokes about it. And so fair use says there are circumstances where we're going to let you use small amounts of the work because of the community discussion related to the work. And people have taken that concept and said, well, if it's on the internet, it's fair use. It's satire. Specifically, it talks about satire in the fair use laws. Well, this is satire. It's like, really? Where's the satire? Well, it's obvious to anybody who's sophisticated and reads it. So do not take anyone's advice when they're telling you what is or isn't fair use. Ultimately, you are standing or falling on a claim of fair use, and it's not something which you can just say, fair use, you can't touch me. It's like, guess what? We're going to court, and you can convince the judge that it's fair use. And again, that's going to cost you time and money. So don't rely on strangers. I am not going to tell you what to sign. I am going to show you an egregious contract and talk about the reasons I did not sign it. And maybe you'll learn something. But before we get into the contracts, I want to do a quick discussion on contests I won't submit to for two reasons. One is excessive fees, and you have to decide what's excessive. You know, I understand that they have to pay their internet bills, they have to pay for coffee in the office and so on. If they're asking for $10 for a submission fee for a contest, I'm not gonna quibble too much. If they're asking for 100, because what happens when you get contests with submission fees is they want as many entries as they can get because that's where their real money comes in. So yes, I have an occasion submitted to a contest with a $70 fee, but that $70 included a critique. And I wanted that critique more than I wanted the contest. Still wish I would have won, but that's a separate matter. The critique was worth the entry fee. So that's one issue. The other is lost rights. Remember, I talked about first rights are worth a lot more than second rights. There are many contests, especially local contests, where they want to do a People's Choice Award sort of thing. So they publish all the winnings or all the entered stories or the top entered stories or something like that online so the people can vote and your first rights have just been gone. And if you want to do that, it's your right to do that. I keep in mind Heinlein's first published story where he had a story that there was, I forget which magazine, there was a contest that was really good money for the day, especially because he was having trouble putting food on the table. And so he wrote the story for that contest and hammered it together. And when he got it all done, he said, this is too good for a contest. And he sent it to that magazine's competition and got more money for the sale than he would have gotten for the contest. If he had given it to the contest, he would have lost his first rights on that. And it wouldn't have been reprinted now, I think 7 or 8 or 9 different times I've seen it. So contests, they are cool. And there's a certain appeal to having some celebrity in the local community. Local library had a 20-word story contest. And I said, 20 words? It takes me 20 words to say hello. Sometimes more than that. And then I'm driving down the road and all of a sudden, bam, 20-word story comes into my head. And I won't get it exactly right from memory, but it's really close. I crept into the cemetery and slept on her grave again last night. Till death do us part was not enough. And I said, that's 20 words. If it wasn't, I trimmed it so it was. I said, that's worth giving them a chance because at 8 cents a word, 20 words is $1.60. If I'm giving up my first rights to $1.60, I don't care. I won third place. So sometimes you can give up the rights because you see some other benefit from it. Well, that's just a note on contests. Now let's get into the Hollywood contract. And I'm going to call it that because I am not going to give you any details about who it was, what the project was, who were the partners, where it was happening, or anything. I've filed off every serial number I possibly can. I am not going to name any of the participants, but I can tell you philosophically what was going on. This was a new publishing house financed by a bunch of investors. Not a publisher, not an editor. It was managed by a bunch of investors who had been studying how Hollywood does intellectual property rights deals and all the ways they make money off things. And in Hollywood, sorry for the rough language here, but they consider screwing you to be a competitive sport. Every way they can take money out of your pocket, even if it doesn't go into theirs, they consider to be a win. And yes, it's not everybody in Hollywood, but it's enough of them that they look for ways to rip you off. And these people, although they were in the publishing books business, they had clearly looked at some of Hollywood's contracts, and this was what they wanted you to sign, and why I didn't sign it. So we're going to start with this, which to me was a giant red flag, which basically says you are not going to discuss these contract terms with anyone. Any third party, any third party. That means not your lawyer, not your agent, not your mentor. You are not going to discuss even contract terminology. You are not going to discuss any of this. Now, it's essentially an unenforceable clause because you can always have private conversations with mentors to advise you, but they are trying right out of the gate. They're trying to keep you from talking to anybody who might talk you out of this lousy contract. This scared me immediately, that they're doing something so shady they don't want me to get advice. And I have seen even worse. I have seen a contract which claimed that before you signed it, by them showing you the contract, you were forbidden to show it to anyone else. Well, I would need to bleep for the next 30 seconds if I talked about what my honest reaction is to that. Because now you are basically trying to lock the writer into a tiny little space where no one can talk to them. There's no way on earth that clause is binding, but it tells me what these people think about you as the writer. Okay, so here they want it all. There are those two terms, exclusive and worldwide. Now, have I ever signed exclusive worldwide? Yes, for lots of money. But keep those in mind as we look at some of the other terms coming up. Exclusive and worldwide. Notice also assignable and sublicensable. Not for me, but for them. They want everything, and we'll see what everything means on the upcoming slides. I own these characters. That's them speaking to me. That's not the way they put it in the contract, but that is the net result. They have the exclusive right to prepare derivative works. That means sequels. They own the rights to make sequels to your work. No. But they wanted it, and that was right up in the very front of the contract. And notice they also wanted to be able to publicly perform the work. Now, I don't think they're talking about us standing on a street corner and reading your story out loud. I think they're after something else, and we'll see the something else coming up in later clauses. So they own these characters, this setting, they own everything. And this is section 1A of everything they're asking for. And they can do anything. Derivative works is nothing. They are able to print, reproduce, and license, which means they can take the book and license it to somebody else. That's not too bad. Sometimes you have there used to be a lot of these, I don't know if there still are, called packagers, who would assemble a book and then license it to a publisher, and they got a cut. But they weren't doing the heavy work of publishing. They were just gathering the authors and the stories together. So licensing isn't that bad. Publicly performed, there it is again. Translations, abridgments, okay. Translations, honestly, it's a lot of work to deal with foreign markets. So if they are having the right to do translations and I'm getting paid for them, I don't care. But abridgments? So what? Do we even still have Reader's Digest condensed books? They're going to be able to make abridgments of my book? Excerpts. Collective works. What? Condensed, adaptive, or abridged works, other editions, and other versions and derivatives in any other format. So now they're basically claiming the ability to reproduce this, and excerpts and collective works. So let's say you have a book like my book, The Last Dance, which is a frame story. It is a story going on in the present of the book where an investigator is investigating whether a captain of a Mars ship should be charged with mutiny or not. And every other chapter is one of the crew telling their story about working with this captain. So this is giving them the right to excerpt those chapters out of that book. That was not the contract for that book. Again, no serial numbers. But in theory, if they had that clause, they could turn around and sell those to magazines as short stories. They could, not me. So they could do anything, and it gets worse. We own the future. Redevelopment for use as the publisher sees fit for future projects. They can rewrite my whole book. What else does redevelopment mean? Doesn't have a legal term here in the contract. They are basically saying this is our stuff now. We can do whatever we want with it. And I didn't even bother highlighting this one. They are owning the audiobooks. They're owning everything about audiobooks. Now, here's the bad news. It's hard to get a novel publishing contract these days that does not have a version of that clause in it. And you have to decide if you're going to live with it or not. I always tell the truth to you in these sessions, even though these are things I don't normally discuss in public. When I sold my first novel to Baen, they asked for the rights to the audiobooks. I love Baen. I wanted to sell to them really bad. My agent wanted to sell to them pretty bad. He wasn't quite as impressed as I was. But he said, I don't think so. I think I can sell the audio rights. And then I contacted a number of Baen authors who had already published with books with Baen and said, how many of your audiobooks got released? And the answer was that if your name essentially wasn't Drake or Correa or Weber or McMaster Bijold, if you weren't one of their headliners, you never saw an audiobook from Baen. So they were leaving money that could have gone, because if they'd sold the audiobooks, a slice would go to you. They were leaving money on the table that you couldn't get because they were too busy to do this work. Similarly, for translations, if you were not one of their headliners, they were too busy to do translations. And my agent said, we're going to get the audio rights, we're going to keep those, and we're going to keep the translation rights. Now, what ended up happening was he managed to keep the audio rights completely. He managed to negotiate a 60-40 split on translations in my favor. And then he said, okay, they said, and you or we can sell the foreign rights. You decide. And I said, we want to sell them. Now, as it happens, he never sold a single foreign right to that book, which means I'm right back where I would have been with Baen in the contract as they'd originally proposed it. On the other hand, the audio rights, this was years ago. Again, this is changing as audio's getting bigger, but we kept the audio rights, and he sold them to Recorded Books for 3 times my advance for the print rights, for the print and ebooks rights. And then, and it did okay. And then about a year and a half to 2 years later, Baen announced a big new deal they had, that their entire audio catalog was being licensed to Recorded Books. And those authors who had signed those old contracts made not a penny extra on those. Now, they made, again, every sale of an audiobook, they made money on. But I got the 3 times advance on my book because we held onto the audiobook rights. That was 7 years ago or so, maybe 8, I forget exactly. The situation has changed. They're probably going to demand the audio rights, but at least discuss it with them. And then it gets worse. You don't really need multimedia, do you? They were asking for the rights to multimedia versions of your book. And man, look at the multimedia. Dialogue, sounds, music, video, animation, moving images. What does that sound like? What is that thing we used to go to theaters, some of us still do, to watch those things called movies? Didn't they have dialogue and sound and music and video and animation and moving images? But this was subtle. They went beyond that. Explicitly, they wanted the right to exploit my work in motion pictures, including podcasts, webinars, other visual-based media, and right to distribute such derivations by all mechanical, electronic, visual, reproductive, display, and performance transmission, blah, 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 and to create games. They were claiming all of it on a short story collection. Sorry, I wasn't going to describe the project, but I'll go that far. It was a short story collection. And they were claiming derivative works. So every one of those short stories, if it was in a universe I was using somewhere else, they were now claiming exclusive rights and I couldn't use those. And they wanted all my merchandise too. Now, how many people really want the merchandise rights to my story? I don't know, but merchandise is worth money. I don't know if you remember the story about George Lucas. When George Lucas was trying to convince the studio to do that little film called Star Wars, like we knew it back then, and he was having trouble getting them to accept terms, he accepted lower payment for his work as director and film writer in exchange for merchandise rights. Back in a time where merchandise was an afterthought of an afterthought. And what did George do? He practically turned around and created the movie merchandise business, because there were Star Wars toys and tie-in books and underwear and whatever everywhere. These people want to make sure that if somebody's wearing underwear from my book, they're getting the money for that underwear. I was like, no, it's my underwear. I get paid for it. And for the rest of eternity. They want it for the entire full periods of copyright, including renewing extensions under any copyright laws now or hereafter in force. So if the laws got changed, the copyright went with it. And historically, this has recently started changing. Historically, the copyright kept getting extended roughly, and this is purely coincidence. I'm sure this had nothing to do with any money going into any congressional bank accounts. The period of copyright would miraculously get extended every time Steamboat Willie was on the verge of becoming public domain. Disney would grease as many palms as it took to keep Steamboat Willie and therefore Mickey Mouse out of public domain. Today, they have surrendered. Steamboat Willie is public domain. So you can make your own Mickey Mouse cartoons and whatever, as long as it is based only on what appears in Steamboat Willie. Over time, as more Mickey cartoons become public domain, if Disney doesn't grease palms to make that happen, you'll be able to use more and more. In a similar fashion, Sherlock Holmes, and this has slowly changed over time. Britain has slightly different terms for copyright, but under the US, they reached a point a few years back where every Sherlock Holmes story published before a certain date, and that date grew 1 year every year, was public domain in the US, and you could write your own Sherlock Holmes stories legally as long as it didn't use any element that came after that date. And I think at this point, every Holmes story is now past that date. If you're going to, however, write your own Sherlock Holmes, keep in mind that for these books, and I don't know the legal details, I'm not your lawyer, but my understanding is there is a slightly longer copyright term for these books. And so you might have a book which can legally be published in the US and not in the UK. So they wanted essentially the end of these rights for me forever.
What if you wanted to turn one of your stories into a game as you were writing it? Could you get that into your contract at all, or again, they control
You could
that as well?
absolutely negotiate it in the contract that you are not selling game rights.
Okay.
And today, games are big. If you are able, if you have the leverage to put that in the contract, do not let them take your game rights if you're not getting compensated. Now, if they had come to me and said, okay, we're going to give you an extra $50,000 for the game rights, I might have looked and said, you know what? I don't think I could negotiate better with anybody. Go ahead. But they weren't offering me $50,000. They were offering me not a penny more than what they were offering for the collection as a whole.
Okay, gotcha.
You do want to think about that and negotiate that and remember the power of no. And now, once you've signed this contract, if they want, remember, they might get run over by a bus and the next person in line might hate you. Your career is done. 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 Because you are not allowed to prepare, publish, or participate in the preparation or publication of any competing work that is substantially similar or likely to injure sales of the work. There's no contractual definition of substantially similar. They come to you and say, don't do that. And you say, I want to do that. And they say, okay, we'll see you in court. And our lawyer is really, really good and charges me $150 an hour. So you're going to have to pay at least that much for a lawyer to fight us. Substantially similar has no meaning other than what they assert in court that it means. And notice, likely to injure sales of the work. So it doesn't even have to be similar. So if you wrote a vampire story and here comes a new vampire story, that is at least substantially similar, maybe. But also, if you wrote a story which basically said that people who read vampire stories are the stupidest people on the planet and everyone should shun them, this publisher could look and say, we think that's going to injure sales of the work. You can't do that. Or even if you wrote a story that said puppy dogs are cute and this publisher wanted to screw with you, they could say that's likely to injure sales of the work because not everybody likes puppies, so you can't publish that. And it's during the duration of this agreement, which is copyright term, which is death plus 70 years. You cannot publish anything without their explicit approval. I'm not giving that kind of power. And you may say this sounds like no one would ever do that. Again, then put it in writing. Because there are cases where people were shut out of their own story worlds because somebody decided, well, that book was about space travel and this book is about space travel. So no, you can't participate in that. And notice participate in the preparation or publication, which means I can't help Anne Marie with her work. If she wants to send me a story for feedback, I can't give it to her because I might be substantially similar or likely to injure sales of the work. I can't do that without their permission. They own me now. They own my career. Never. There are valid non-compete clauses. This isn't one of them. So if they wanted to say, and it's not duration of this agreement, but let's say if they want to say for 5 years, you will not publish any other novel with these stories unless we have first right of refusal. That's okay. Not great, but it's okay. But duration of this agreement, publish or participate, substantial, no way. You're starting to see where I was at this point fuming out my ears and not a chance I was signing this. And then they go and register it in the Copyright Office under their name. They wrote this according to this. This isn't quite work for hire like the deal Rich was talking about, but it's worse in some ways. They are claiming we are the authors of this, and the publisher shall be considered the sole and absolute owner of the copyright and distribution on the work. The air was turning blue when I read this one. Always, the copyright should be in your name. Now, there is a small variant on this. What will often happen if you sell a story to a magazine is they will register it as copyright this issue of the magazine to them for this story by you. So it is acknowledging that they were where it appeared first. I still don't like it, but they all do it, and it's something I don't consider that horrible. They're just basically registering it that this is where this appeared. And also, and this was not one that came up here, but I'll talk about it while I'm on the subject. What may happen when you're selling to an anthology, if they know how to craft their contract clauses well, is they will talk about something along the lines of, will be able to republish this in any format and whatever the period of time and so on, as long as it appears as the entire anthology, not as an individual story. So what they're saying is if you gave like exclusivity for a year to an anthology, they still want to sell that 18 months from now. So they want to be able to have the rights to continue to sell that anthology. I'm like, more power to you. Please do. I want you to make money. But they don't have a right to my story by itself. They have a right to sell the anthology as a whole. And that gets a little tricky sometimes because depending on how rights were negotiated, you may find if somebody negotiated something special and they felt it was worth it, you may find that some rights in the anthology expire sooner than others. And so they may have to pull the version that has those stories and re-release as a version that has only the remaining stories. This is a pretty obscure case. If they did, I wouldn't complain. If mine was the last story left, I might complain. But if we had an anthology with 15 stories and suddenly it's reissued with 12, I'm not going to complain on that. Okay, just a few other issues, and I have no idea how I'm doing on time. Oh, I'm only a little over. I'm doing pretty good this week. 20 minutes is usually only a small amount for me. A couple of things that will be terms you'll see in a lot of contracts that I don't think are bad, but I want you aware of them. These were not reasons not to sign, but it's things to think about. One is indemnification. They will ask for a clause that says, you didn't steal this from anybody, you didn't slander anybody, you didn't slur anybody. These days, I'm sure it probably says something like you didn't use AI in the creation of this work. What they're doing is they're protecting themselves so that somebody comes along and says, hey, Random House, this book was stolen from me or parts of it were. Random House can point and say, he did it, he did it. You can't sue us, he did it. He signed a contract saying he did it. Now, lawyers being lawyers, they're still liable to go to the multi-billion-dollar company instead of me to try to get as much money as they can. But they want that on record, in writing, that I am saying I am responsible for what went in this book. They aren't. I don't consider that bad. Jurisdiction. Where are the clauses in this contract going to be interpreted under what jurisdictional law? And I'm going to tell you what you want. I'm going to tell you what you're going to get. You want it to be in your state. Unless you live in a state that is really, really unfriendly to creators, California being one of those. But other than that, you want it to be in your state because you want to have a short drive to court if things go wrong. Why do you think they want it in their state? So they can have a short drive to court, and they've probably researched the laws of copyright in their state that may be very specific, and so they're more familiar with them. If somebody says it's going to be settled in Utah, I'm really not going to argue about it. But if I had a choice, I'd want it in Michigan. And finally, most important, reversion clauses. And these are things that, depending on the company, they're probably not going to put them in. You want to negotiate them in if you feel like it's worth the fight, which is reversion says, I get those rights back under certain conditions. I mentioned earlier, if it's not earning $100 per year in royalties is one reversion clause. There can be a bunch of them, but essentially it is the rights under which, or the rules under which you can automatically get your rights back. Unfortunately, some publishers are really stingy with giving them back. It can be really difficult sometimes, and I've heard horror stories about clawing your rights back. Having the reversion clause in writing in the contract gets you a few steps down the road on that reversion. All right. Couple of final questions I want you to think about. If somebody gives you a contract with a lot of problems, doesn't that make you begin to doubt their business sense or even maybe their ethics and honesty if they're willing to grab your rights without compensating you for them? And even if they clean up their contract, what does that say that they had such an awful contract, what happens to the next author who comes along? Are they doing this as a matter of course? And sadly, the answer is often yes. Kristen Catherine Rush, who is an amazing editor and author and teacher, used to work in the editorial department of, I forget which company, and I don't think I'm allowed to say it if I do, but she had a story she would tell where an author would come in and say, okay, I want to do this. And the editor talks to him, everybody kind of agrees. And the editor tells you, the person running errands in the back, go get the M contract. And you're new, so you don't know what this is. You just go to the drawer labeled M and pull out the M contract. And you bring it back and they hand it to the author, and the author takes it back to their agent and their lawyer and comes back and says, these rights you're asking for is too much. You know it's too much. I know it's too much. It's too much. And the editor says to you, okay, go back and get the K contract. They already knew that that M contract was full of issues, and they had an L and a K and a J and an I and so on, so that essentially when they got pushback, they didn't have to go to the lawyers to correct one single contract. They already had the corrected contracts in their drawers waiting to see what they could get away with. Okay. Caveat emptor. I agree that businesses need to do what they need to do to make money, but that just feels a little sleazy to me, that they knew there were problems with that contract, but if you were okay with it, they were okay with it. So if you see a lot of problems with a contract, you need to decide what you're going to do about it. I decided in the case of this contract that I wasn't even going to try to negotiate a better one. This contract was so horribly bad that I had lost any faith in the ethics of these people. And even if I pushed back successfully, I had to always be looking over my shoulder to see what they were going to do to me next. And I walked away, and that project has never seen the light of day. And I'm okay with that because it'd be better than this contract. All right, questions? All right. Then I want to finish up. Here's the
I have one
upcoming.
quick question. Sorry.
Sure.
Is it better to send in multiple books for characters at a different time if you're looking for a single contract, or it's better to stick to one character and author or one book?
That's partly depends on your work habits, your ability to have the multiple books. I always
Okay.
kind of feel like if you have multiples, shop multiples.
Okay, so like shop
And
around
it
with
is,
them.
yeah, and it is even for novels, it is even common that you send a book to multiple publishers at once. For short stories, it's much less common, and you need to look and see if they'll let you get away with it. My rule is don't even try. One story at a time to one market. I might send a different story to a different market, but I'm not going to send the same story to multiple markets. There's a lot of discussion there that gets very heated because some people think they absolutely have the right to do that, even if the publisher says they don't. And I know of a couple of cases of authors who burned their reputation because a publisher said, we want that story, and got told, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have it because so-and-so already wants it.
Okay, got it. And you should make sure that they're not like too similar either if you were going to shop several of them all around at the same time, correct?
I don't think similarity, I mean, if they're not overlapping in words, I don't think it's a problem.
Okay.
If they're
Okay, thank you.
overlapping in character setting, to me, I'm not your lawyer, but
Mhm.
to me, that's a separate issue.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So here's our upcoming schedule. Next week, we'll be talking about the heart of the story, humanity and empathy in science fiction and other fiction. This was not something no one can ever look at their own work. This is not something I knew I was good at. I still sometimes have trouble believing it, but Dave Wolverton asked me to teach this specifically for his Apex writing group, and I looked and said, I can try, Dave, but I don't know why you're asking me. I'm a nuts and bolts hard science fiction guy. And he said, no, you're not. And I went to a bunch of friends and said, Dave wants me to talk about this. I'm a hard science fiction guy. And they all said, no, you're not. I'm like, what? I said, no, you're all about humanity in your stories. Okay. So I put together a class session for Dave. And it went off well, and I taught it again at FireCon. And next week I will be teaching it to anyone who shows up here. And then after that, I will be doing the first of what I want to do to change things up in a while, tributes to my mentors and the books that influenced me and so on. And since Dave was the one who asked for the heart of the story, I will be talking about, assuming I can keep my voice from trembling, I will be talking about Dave Wolverton and everything he meant to my career and the careers of thousands of other writers, and talking about some of his references and resources that are still relevant today and you may want to look into. The fifth, we'll be talking about 12 things that aren't writer's block, but you may think they are, and what you can do about them. The 22nd, I'll be talking about dictation. Kevin J. Anderson and Greg Vos and I have a book called On Being a Dictator, which is about methods of dictating fiction, which has become absolutely my primary method, Greg's primary method, Kevin's primary method. Last weekend, I was at a Renaissance fair where in 2 half-hour sessions, I dictated close to 8,000 words of completely original, spontaneous stories in response to audience prompts. Because I've gotten really good at dictation and I have a freak brain which can come up with story on demand. If only it could do it every day, I would have so much work out there. So we're talking about dictation. 29th is ruthless consistency. As I said, I dictated 2 complete stories. Actually, I dictated more than 2, but I recorded 2 last weekend. I dictated dictated, I want to say 5 complete stories. How do you keep a story straight as you're dictating? And that's the concept of ruthless consistency and how to build world building, all the elements of your world over time from story to story. July 6th will be how long is a piece of string, which is talking about story lengths in different genres, because the rules of different lengths, what constitutes a novel, what constitutes a short story, differ by genre. And I just, in the past week, saw a gentleman posting on his Substack some additional research that I'm going to share, which is average, well, not average, but the sizes of popular novels over the past like 200 years. So you can see something of how the sizes are changing over time. July 13, we'll be playing the goal game, which Anne Marie and I did for one of her stories recently. It's simple ways of asking questions to nail down what you want your story to be. And then 20th, I will be talking about frame stories and other nonlinear narratives in a class I call How I Met Your Story. And it would be talking about ways that stories don't have to be told in linear order, and which is apparently something I'm really fascinated with. I never realized it, but I start looking at all of my favorite stories and how many of them are nonlinear. And from that, we will go to Dwarves in the Woods, the 4 levels of learning, which is a topic I talk about in many different classes, but I want to talk about this one in specific. It may be a shorter one. I think I can explain the concepts on here in under a half hour, and if that's the case, then we'll have time to talk and discuss your questions on writing and so on. August 3 will be another tribute, this time to Dean Wesley Smith. After Dave, Dean is probably the mentor I quote the most often. So that's coming up. If you've got the message here to be here today, you will be on my list that I will send out the meeting invitations for each of these, unless you send me a cease and desist order to say, please, I don't want to see your stuff anymore. It's all junk. All right. Any last questions? All right. Then we are finished here. I will stop the share.